The night hell came to Peleliu, when 10,000 Marines walked into Japan's perfect trap. The coral dust clung to everything: uniforms, weapons, skin. It was September 15th, 1944, and the Marines of the 1st Division were about to step into what would become known as the most savage battle in Pacific War history. Intelligence had promised them a quick victory, 3 days to secure the tiny island of Peleliu. Instead, they were walking into a nightmare that would last 74 days and claim over 10,000 American casualties. Welcome to World War IIpedia, where we uncover the untold stories of World War II. Today, we're covering one of the most overlooked battles of the Pacific Theater. Colonel Lewis Chesty Pullers, 1st Marines, hit the beach first, expecting the usual Japanese tactics: banzai charges and coastal defenses. What they found was something far more terrifying: silence. The Japanese had vanished, leaving behind only the oppressive heat and an eerie calm that made every Marine's skin crawl. But Colonel Kunio Nakagawa was watching. Hidden deep within Peleliu's coral ridges, he had spent months preparing the perfect trap. This wouldn't be another suicidal charge. This would be a methodical slaughter. 3 weeks earlier, Marine intelligence officers had pored over aerial photographs of Peleliu, confident in their assessment. The island appeared lightly defended, a few coastal guns, some scattered bunkers. Major General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had boldly predicted, "We'll be through in 3 days. It might only take 2. The Marines had good reason for confidence. They had just crushed Japanese forces at Saipan and Guam, using overwhelming firepower and aggressive tactics. The enemy's predictable banzai charges had been mowed down by disciplined Marine rifle fire. Peleliu would be more of the same, or so they believed. But Colonel Nakagawa had studied every American victory. A brilliant tactician and veteran of campaigns in China, he understood that the old ways meant certain death. Instead of meeting the Marines at the water's edge, he would let them come to him. Deep within Peleliu's coral limestone, his engineers had carved out an underground fortress that defied imagination. The Umur Ridge, soon to be known as Bloody Nose Ridge, had been transformed into a labyrinth of interconnected caves, tunnels, and firing positions. Some caverns were large enough to hold entire companies. Others were narrow slots barely wide enough for a single soldier, but positioned to deliver devastating crossfire. Nakagawa's 10,000 defenders could move unseen through this underground network, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. As the pre-invasion bombardment pounded Peleliu's surface, Nakagawa's men waited safely below. 3 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing had turned the island's vegetation to ash, but the Japanese fortress remained untouched. The Americans had no idea they were about to assault an enemy that couldn't be seen, couldn't be flanked, and refused to die. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as the first wave of Marines approached Peleliu's western beaches. The coral sand was blindingly white, and the heat was already unbearable at 0800 hours. Private Eugene Sledge, clutching his mortar rounds, later wrote, "The heat was like a living thing, pressing down on us with malevolent intent." The landing craft ground against the coral reef, and Marines poured over the sides into chest-deep water. They expected machine gun fire, artillery, the usual hell of an opposed landing. Instead, they found only the sound of their own breathing and the gentle lapping of waves against coral. Colonel Pullers' 1st Marines hit Beach White 1 and immediately began pushing inland. The silence was unnerving. Where were the Japanese? Scattered rifle shots rang out from the ridgeline, but nothing like the fierce resistance they had encountered elsewhere. Some Marines began to relax. Maybe intelligence had been right after all. Hidden observers in the coral cliffs had been tracking every Marine movement. At precisely 10:30 hours, Nakagawa gave the signal. The ridge erupted in a symphony of death. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces that had remained silent during the bombardment now spoke with devastating precision. Marines who had been advancing confidently across open ground suddenly found themselves caught in a killing field. The coral dust that had seemed merely annoying now became a choking cloud that obscured vision and clogged weapons. Men fell by the dozens, cut down by an enemy they couldn't see. Sergeant Jim McCannery watched in horror as his squad was decimated. They were shooting at us from positions we couldn't even locate. It was like fighting ghosts. The Marines tried to return fire, but their bullets struck only empty coral. The Japanese would fire a few rounds, then vanish back into their tunnels before counter-battery fire could find them. By nightfall on September 15th, the Marines had secured a tenuous foothold on Peleliu, but at a terrible cost. The 1st Marines alone had suffered over 200 casualties in the first day, more than some units had lost in entire previous campaigns. And this was just the beginning. The next morning brought a new horror: the assault on Bloody Nose Ridge. The coral formation rose 200 feet above the surrounding terrain, honeycombed with caves and defensive positions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. Every advance was met with withering fire from multiple directions. Marines would fight all day to capture a single cave, only to discover it connected to a dozen others. Private Sledge described the nightmare. We'd throw grenades into a cave, hear the explosion, then immediately take fire from the same position. It was like the coral itself was shooting at us. The Japanese had perfected a deadly game of hide-and-seek. They would allow Marines to approach, then emerge from hidden positions to attack from behind. The heat was becoming as deadly as enemy fire. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees, and the coral reflected the sun's rays like a furnace. Marines collapsed from heat exhaustion faster than they fell to Japanese bullets. Water became more precious than ammunition. Men fought over the contents of their canteens, and some units went 48 hours without resupply. Colonel Pooler, the legendary Marine commander, found himself facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered in 3 decades of warfare. His aggressive tactics, which had worked so well elsewhere, were useless against an enemy that refused to show itself. "It's like fighting the island itself," he told his staff officers. "Every rock, every cave, every piece of coral is the enemy." By September 23rd, 8 days into what was supposed to be a 3-day operation, the 1st Marines had been bled white. Of the 3,000 men who had landed on Peleliu, fewer than 1,200 remained combat effective. Companies that had started with 200 men were down to 40 or 50. Some platoons had been reduced to a handful of survivors. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical casualties. Marines who had fought bravely through previous campaigns found themselves paralyzed by an enemy they couldn't see or understand. The constant threat of death from invisible positions wore down even the most hardened veterans. Private Ray Ree later recalled, "You'd be talking to your buddy 1 second, and the next second his head would just disappear. Snipers shot from somewhere up in those damn caves. We never even heard the rifle crack. The Marines began to move like hunted animals, darting from cover to cover, never knowing when death would strike. But Nakagawa's defenders were suffering too. Cut off from resupply and facing constant bombardment, they were slowly being ground down. The colonel knew his position was hopeless in the long term, but he was determined to make the Americans pay the highest possible price. Every day Peleliu held out was another day the U.S. Pacific offensive was delayed. The Japanese had prepared for a siege. Deep in their coral fortress, they had stockpiled food, water, and ammunition for months of fighting. Medical stations had been carved out of solid rock. Command posts were buried so deep that direct hits from battleship guns couldn't reach them. Nakagawa had created a fortress that could only be taken by the complete destruction of every defender. October brought no relief. The 1st Marines, decimated beyond recognition, were finally withdrawn and replaced by the 81st Infantry Division. But the killing continued. Every cave had to be cleared individually, often with flamethrowers and explosives. Marines would spend days fighting for positions no larger than a living room. The coral itself became a weapon. Shattered by explosions, it created razor-sharp fragments that sliced through uniforms and flesh. The dust got into everything: eyes, lungs, weapons. Men coughed up blood from breathing the pulverized limestone. Some Marines went temporarily blind from the constant irritation. Colonel Nakagawa, deep in his command bunker, continued to direct the defense with methodical precision. He rotated his troops through different positions, ensuring that fresh defenders always faced the exhausted Americans. His radio messages to Tokyo were brief and professional. Enemy advances slowly. Our casualties acceptable. We'll continue resistance. But by late October, even Nakagawa knew the end was near. His ammunition was running low, his men were starving, and the Americans had finally begun to understand the cave system well enough to attack it systematically. On October 24th, he sent his final message to Imperial headquarters. "Our sword is broken, and we have run out of spears. I will strike the enemy with my broken sword." That night, Nakagawa committed ritual suicide in his command bunker, 200 feet below ground. His remaining troops, now leaderless but still defiant, continued fighting for another week before the last organized resistance finally ended. When the guns finally fell silent on November 27, 1944, Peleliu had been transformed into a moonscape of shattered coral and twisted metal. The three-day operation had lasted 74 days and cost the Americans over 10,000 casualties, nearly 40% of the assault force. Of Nakagawa's 10,000 defenders, only 202 survived to be taken prisoner. The Marines had won, but at a price that shook the American High Command. General MacArthur, reviewing the casualty reports, reportedly said, "The name Peleliu will be remembered as long as men study warfare." The battle had demonstrated that Japanese defenders, when properly prepared and led, could exact a terrible toll even in defeat. For the Marines who survived, Peleliu became a defining experience. They had faced an enemy that fought with scientific precision rather than fanatical emotion. The random banzai charges of earlier campaigns had been replaced by calculated killing that continued until the very last defender was dead. Private Sledge, reflecting on the battle years later, wrote, "Peleliu was the closest thing to hell I ever experienced. We didn't just fight the Japanese. We fought the island itself, and it nearly won." The lessons learned in Peleliu's coral caves would shape American tactics for the rest of the Pacific War. The age of quick victories was over. From now on, every island would be a potential fortress. Every battle, a potential Peleliu. The road to Tokyo would be paved with coral dust and American blood. This is the kind of forgotten story that defines World War II-pedia. While history books focus on the famous victories, we dig deeper into the battles that changed everything. The moments when courage met horror, when strategy collided with reality, and when ordinary men faced extraordinary circumstances. If you want to discover more untold stories from the war that shaped our world, subscribe and join us as we uncover the hidden chapters of World War II. Because every battle had heroes, every defeat had lessons, and every story deserves to be remembered.